Asymmetric warfare is a struggle between a high-tech army and low-tech insurgents. And it is a war that is greatly misunderstood because people assume the extraordinary superiority of the high-tech army. But in fact, the high-tech army doesn't usually win. The United States was not able to defeat the Viet Cong in Vietnam. We have not been able to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan. We were not able to defeat either the Sunni or the Shiite militias in Iraq. The Israeli army did not lose the wars in Lebanon and Gaza, but it didn't win them, at least not in any of the usual senses of the word win. And one of the reasons that the high-tech army doesn't do well is because it loses the political battle, even when it wins or could win the military battle. So and it's the moral issue that we were that General Yalon has just been talking about, that frames the political struggle. So that's what I want to talk about. Now, the insurgents, the Viet Cong or Hamas, the insurgents face two critical moral questions. Do they aim their weapons against military or civilian targets? And do they use their own civilians as cover, deliberately exposing them to enemy fire, or not? Now, Israel's enemies have generally given the wrong answers to both those questions, and so have many of America's enemies. Those wrong decisions, and particularly the second one, to fight from civilian cover, then pose critical moral questions for the IDF and the US Army. And those are the questions that I want to address, and I should say a word about how I address them. I've written about just and unjust wars. I defend the just wars and criticize the unjust wars. In 1967, I was running around the United States making arguments against the Vietnam War. And then suddenly, at the same time, I was making arguments in support and defense of Israel's preemptive strike against Egypt. And that's the origin of my book. The unjust war was Vietnam, and the just war was Israel in Egypt. I talked about a lot of other wars, but those were the two that from which the book derives. When I talk about just and unjust wars and conduct of wars in the United States, about the wars of this country, I talk as an American citizen. When I talk about Israel's wars, I always do it in association with friends in Israel. And the difference is important because I understand the solidarity of Israeli society, which I'm not part of or not fully part of. And I also understand the vulnerability of Israeli society, which isn't my own vulnerability. So that's why I always associate myself, as you'll hear me do in a minute, with Israeli friends. Now, my Israeli friends are my age. They are old Mapainiks and Mapamniks, and I suspect that many of them would have disagreements with General Yalon, or though not about the issues that he talked about here. I suspect that they wish, as I do, that he was still in the cabinet. So let's look at the question, and I will do it initially from an American standpoint, but the questions are the same. How should US soldiers respond to Taliban militants firing from the roof of a small apartment building in an Afghan town where there are or might be Afghan families in the building? They might just be living there, or they might have been forcibly prevented from leaving. Or how should the IDF respond to Hamas rockets fired from a schoolyard or a hospital parking lot? So the underlying question, the really hard question, is how much risk can we ask our soldiers to accept in order to reduce the risks they impose on enemy civilians who are being used by the enemy? That is the really hard moral question. It's an Israeli debate and an American debate. I've participated in the Israeli debate along with Avishai Margalit. We wrote an article together in Haaretz, the two of us arguing against the views of Asa Kasher. Asa thinks there should be no risk beyond the risks of the military mission. You shouldn't ask soldiers to take any additional risks. And Avishai and I were arguing for additional risks, as I'll do in a minute with regard to Afghanistan. Asa and I have also argued at academic conferences and in academic journals, but the argument isn't academic, as you can see. But I know the argument best from my encounters with the US Army when I lecture at West Point, because Just and Unjust Wars is a required text at West Point, or at the Army War College in Pennsylvania. Now, the example of Taliban militants firing from the roof of a small apartment building, which is probably a simplified example, was described to me by a colonel at the Army War College. And I think he was one of the people who participated in the revision of the Army's war rules of engagement. I'll come to that in a minute. So, American troops draw fire from the roof of this building. They don't know who's in the building. And what should they do? So this is what these are the options the colonel laid out. They can pull back and call in the artillery or an airstrike. And he said, that's what we did in the old days. That's what we did in the old days, before General McChrystal's new rules of engagement were announced in 2010. Or you can try to get soldiers onto the roof of a nearby building so that they can fire directly at the Taliban militants. You can try to get soldiers into the building to see if there are civilians in the building, families in the building, because if there are none, then you can call in the artillery. Or, he said, if the junior officer on the ground thinks the risks of trying to get soldiers onto the roof of a building or into the building are too great, you can withdraw. Now, withdrawing violates the central principle of the US Army, probably of the IDF, never to leave the battlefield to the enemy. But, he said, in this case, according to the new rules of engagement, if the risks are too great for the other options, then you withdraw. And then he looked at me, because I had just given a lecture on the difficulties of the IDF in the first Lebanon war. He looked at me and he said, we don't have to worry about a ceasefire. We can fight a slow war. And the meaning was the IDF always has to worry about whether they can accomplish the military mission before the world imposes a ceasefire. The IDF is always fighting a fast war. And it was a wonderful moment for me, because it was obviously an expression of sympathy. Of the sort that I've encountered again and again, speaking at the military academies and at the War College. the American officer corps really does regard the IDF as the closest army in the world. So those are the options, and then the question is, what does the junior officer who has to make that decision do? And according to General McChrystal's revised rules, you cannot call in the airstrike, or at least you can't do that first. You have to accept some risk in order to reduce the risk to civilians. And the New York Times carried a whole series of interviews with soldiers, US soldiers in Afghanistan, after those rules were announced, who were very unhappy about the rules. The officers I talked to at West Point are generally in favor of those rules, but soldiers on the ground said this makes the war more dangerous than we think it ought to be. But the American rules of engagement, and I suspect the IDF rules, do require some degree of risk. And that sounds right to me, though I do not believe that moral philosophers can specify what degree of risk. It's not 17 or 36. This has got to be a decision made on the ground by the junior officer who is there, and that's why the training of junior officers is so important. So important to make sure that the rules of engagement, whatever they are clearly understood, and understood in the same way by all the officers. And of course, they are never understood in exactly the same way by all the officers. The soldiers I've talked to who have been in Afghanistan, and the soldiers I've talked to who have been in Gaza, they are the grandchildren of my Israeli friends. They do say that different units fight differently depending on that junior officer. How smart is he? How calm is he? An Israeli friend of mine who's been in, I think, all the wars said to me, brutality in war is the product of incompetence, most often the product of incompetence. I would add also emotion gone awry, fear and anger.